Terence, the first proposition speaker. We're now presenting to the floor. To the floor, if you wish to present your arguments as debaters, you may stand up. And if you are chosen, a mic will be presented to you and you will have 5 minutes to state your case. So we call upon the floor. Anyone who wishes to take it up, please stand up.
I have a question for the opposition on the part of representation. Now, the proposition mentioned on how both of you are not Sarawakians, and when you came, you felt the divisiveness as if you were coming to a whole different country, isn't it? Now, in the event if we do have more seats for MPs, let's say for Sarawak, we increase it maybe by half, wouldn't that solve the issues of not having enough representation in Parliament? Thank you.
If anyone wishes to speak, you may rise up. Present your case forward.
Okay, this is a question for the opposition side. Regarding to earlier on, there was a small piece that you said within your speech talking about Sarawak nationalism, whatever it may be. Now that struck me really well because debating on the side of opposition, advocating for Sarawak nationalism, there is no doubt the fact that Sarawak nationalism works as a sort of drive, but it is also about the constitution of Sarawak nationalism in itself, which the honourable member of the opposition did not exactly characterise or justify. And with the lack of the characterisation, such as within S4S or the Sarawak exit, how exactly does that help in driving forward actual change within that? Thank you.
Thank you very much to our second audience debater. We are closing it for the audience and the floor. Now we'll present and request the second proposition speaker, Ms. Catherine, to present her case forward. Here.
Growing up in Miri, Sarawak gave me the unique opportunity of seeing a different side of Sarawak. Coming from KL itself and my family all being born in KL, I had the ability to see both East and West and to compare my unique experience of how these two blocks of the nation interact with each other. In that sense, there is an undeniable gap between the East and the West. And I am here to argue that nationalism is not doing anything to bridge this gap, and this harms Sarawakians on the ground. There are two general parts to my speech. The first is on responses to the speaker on the opposition team, and the second is on the argument of unity and how we're able to utilize unity to a better extent and how that is more beneficial to Sarawakians as compared to nationalism. The first response on what is Sarawakian nationalism. I think the question that was raised by the audience debater earlier on did have some merit in suggesting that there is no precise definition as to what Sarawakian nationalism is. However, that does not justify the opposition team from cherry-picking what are only the good sides of Sarawak nationalism without taking into consideration everything that Asan has talked to you about Sarawak nationalism. Narratives like Sarawak First or Sarawak Exit do very little to help with any productive conversations or discussions on how Sarawak rights can be maintained on a federal level. To that extent, I would like the opposition team to engage on these aspects of how the rise of Sarawak nationalism has evolved into a form of nationalism that has transcended Sarawakian pride and has resulted in an ugly figure that has been open to exploitation by various political entities. But secondly, on the injustices that Sarawak faces, the team proposition in this debate will not deny the injustices that Sarawak has faced throughout its long history. Of course, the rights of Sarawak has been taken away from them. The ability of Sarawakians to self-actualize and to enjoy the benefits that they reap from their own land has been stripped away from them, and we sympathize. However, in that sense, this debate is not about how the injustices themselves are harmful, but rather how does nationalism result in these injustices being turned away. In all the arguments that have been presented by the opposition speaker, there's been very little link as to how nationalism is the cure to all the ways in which the federal government has mistreated Sarawak or has not treated Sarawak as an equal partner in the federation. To that extent, opposition has an extremely high burden burden in proving to you why nationalism is the cure to that, given that they've already taken the burden to prove that these injustices are harming the nation. In lieu of that, our burden in this debate, and reiterating what my teammate Asan has already spoken to you about, is very simple. Nationalism, Sarawak nationalism in of itself has its benefits, we do not deny that. But the rise of Sarawak nationalism, as we see today, is harmful to the Sarawakian people in terms of achieving unity, and to that extent, we regret the rise of Sarawak nationalism. Second response on fixing the development inequality as what the opposition team has raised. In terms of all these local industries that opposition team has talked about, the first response that I would posit before the members of the floor is, what is the exclusivity of Sarawak nationalism? I would argue that all of these industries and all of these ways in which Sarawakians have founded upon themselves to make a better life for themselves is due to Sarawak ingenuity or Sarawak pride. I don't know why this is necessarily Sarawak nationalism, where you put Sarawak first, or you put them in a sense that that Sarawak is better, or at least has not been given the rights necessarily dictated to them in MA63. To that extent, opposition needs to prove the link between Sarawak nationalism and the way in which they're able to solve these injustices before they can credit it to a positive benefit for Sarawak nationalism. Moving on to my argument in terms of unity. Asan has already laid the foundation of this argument in his speech by suggesting that unity is the foundation for this nation. I will extend this argument and prove to you why unity is the best way in which we're able to at least redress or solve many of the injustices that Sarawak faces today, and why this is a preferred alternative as compared to Sarawak nationalism, thus proving that Sarawak nationalism takes away from unity and takes away the ability of Sarawak to regain its rights. There are three parts to this argument. The first, what do we mean by unity? The second, how does nationalism take away from unity? And the third, why do we prefer unity over Sarawak nationalism? The first part of this argument, what do we mean by unity? We think unity is not just a blatant or a blanket sense of being together and being happy. It is about engaging with different sides of the political spectrum. It is about constant engagement and constant discussion on what is the middle ground to be achieved in various scenarios. Because understand that in terms of making policies, or in terms of fighting for rights, it is a balance of various different needs. Thus, we would argue to you today that Sarawak nationalism does not take into consideration this balance of rights, and thus harms the ability of Sarawak to achieve any form of progress when it comes to addressing the injustices there. Second part of this argument, how do we think Sarawak nationalism takes away from unity? Asan has given you many reasons to suggest that Sarawak nationalism is harmful to the unity of Sarawak as a whole, and also between the East and the West. It results in the diversion of political and social capital when it comes to discussions on a federal level. It results in the capitalization of issues that are populist in nature rather than issues that actually benefit people on the ground. It is likely to result in a devolution of nationalism, where we see individuals take to social media and say, in the name of nationalism, we do not agree with the West, or they use this as a way in which to attack other individuals. We see this externally as well, where the West views Sarawak to be something that is completely different or completely other as compared to the national identity of Malaysia. And in the worst case, nationalism has resulted in a high level of antagonism towards Sarawak, where we see the West completely removing Sarawak from national discussions because of the fact that Sarawak views himself as completely different and as outside of the Malaysian identity. All of these are enough reasons to suggest that Sarawak nationalism has already harmed the progress of Sarawak to form at least to create a stable political landscape. But now moving on to a comparative analysis and taking opposition's case at its best, assuming that nationalism does actually work, what does this actually achieve for Sarawakians? Assuming first and taking the sentiments of nationalism, where it results in more representation representation. Asan has already proven to you why unity is the best way to achieve this type of representation the opposition tries to talk about, in terms of how this representation in the form of nationalism is harmful because it is antagonistic to the federal government that opposition has already proven is more powerful and has the ability to steamroll the rights of Sarawakians. In terms of how it takes away the ability for Sarawakians to identify themselves as a bigger group of, or at least identifying as a bigger group of a Malaysian identity rather than a smaller Sarawakian identity. But in secondly, if assuming that Sarawak nationalism is used to fight for rights, I would argue that a lot of the progress that we have for Sarawak today is due to the unity, or at least the ability for us to engage with the federal government rather than focusing on Sarawak nationalism. This looks like the ability of Sarawak to achieve more autonomy in terms of education and health, which has already been agreed to in principle, or at least the increase in the annual special grant that's granted to Sarawak. These are all recent changes that we have seen in terms of how Sarawak is able to benefit politically and also socially. Opposition will argue that these milestones are due to Sarawak nationalism. However, proposition would argue that these milestones are due to the ability of Sarawakians to put the past behind them and say, look, these are injustices that we face right now. Let us come to the table and let us discuss on a middle ground. What is the best way for us to achieve a solution that benefits everyone, rather than focusing on a Sarawak identity that doesn't necessarily result in tangible change for these individuals. The worst form of Sarawak nationalism results in arguments of secession, where we see individuals arguing that Sarawak should exit the federation. All of these arguments are extremely counterproductive to the ability of Sarawak to focus on its national, or to focus on regaining its rights, because it is extremely divisive in nature and it angers the people when it comes to discussions like this. In terms of unity, when we present arguments in a way in which we engage with the West, or at least we are able to put aside these various conflicts that we have with the West, I think this is the best way in which we're able to achieve some level of progress and change for Sarawakians when it comes to engaging and cooperating with the West. Because arguably, of course, the federal government is much more powerful and holds the ability to take away these rights. To that extent, it is time for us to not continue putting salt in the wound, but to put the past behind us and to argue for the future of Sarawakians today, rather than a vague sense of Sarawak identity that doesn't really result in a productive or healthy discussion for people on the ground. Extremely proud to propose.